Students don't understand the concepts, their applications are next to impossible. So, to understand calculus, we first must reinforce the concepts that are fundamental to its foundation. I believe the key to understanding calculus lies in teaching these concepts. The algebra and complicated math that trip students up can be learned in time, but a student who never grasps the fundamental ideas of calculus can never succeed. So, let's take a step back from everything we know about math and try to learn calculus in a whole new way.
So infinity is really cool because it allows us to talk about things that are either really big or really small. Infinity has this reputation of being known as the biggest number. Have you guys heard of that before?
Yes.
Yes.
It's not.
It's not. Yes, you're correct. If I asked you guys to count the numbers between 1 and 2, 1.1 is slightly bigger than 1, right? And it definitely is between 1 and 2. We all agree?
Yes.
So right now, we have one number between 1 and 2. 1.11 is also between 1 and 2, right? It's a little bit bigger than 1.1, right?
Yes.
So now we have two numbers that are definitely between 1 and 2. 1.111. This is also between 1 and 2. So if we keep adding ones, that's what this ... means over there. That means we can just keep adding 1 on to the end of this number forever. And every single time we add 1 on, the number gets a little bit bigger, right? So it's a unique number. It's a different number that's between 1 and 2 every single time we do this. And if we keep counting these numbers, as in how many numbers are between 1 and 2, we'll never end. That is infinity. Infinity is a concept. And this is crucial to understanding not just infinity, but also for calculus. So now with that, let's talk about 1 over infinity. If I have 1 over 2, we have this one pizza, we cut it in half, and this red right here is the amount of my one slice. We all agree?
Yes.
So now let's go to 1 over 3. We have this one pizza, and we divide it into 3 equal slices. This red slice is the amount of one slice. And now if we divide it into 4, what do we notice? Gets even smaller, right? So when we have 1 over 5, it's a little bit smaller. Okay? 1 over 6, 1 over 15. Let's look at 1 over 80.
Whoa!
What would happen if we go to 1 over infinity? The question is it equal to 0? So remember that infinity is not a number. So 1 over infinity doesn't represent anything. Remember, we had to have a number on the bottom of this thing, right? We have to divide it into a certain number of slices. And if we divide it by infinity, to me, that means nothing. But what does that mean about our pizza slice? Well, we said it's not equal to 0. But what we can say is that 1 over infinity goes to 0. When we increase that number on the bottom, our slice gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And if we keep doing that forever, and we keep adding 1 to that bottom number, our slice is getting closer and closer and closer to being nothing, but it's never equal to nothing. What this is called, and this is important, this is infinitely small. One over infinity is an infinitely small number. Just like infinity is an infinitely large number. Let's move on to something that I know you're familiar with, area. I want to talk to you guys about an interesting way to take area. So let's say we're trying to calculate the area of a triangle. A way that we might be able to do it is by taking something whose area that we do know and filling our triangle with it. So let's say we have our quarters stacked up like this. We want to say, what is the area of a triangle that has this shape? Well, let's count the quarters and say, how many quarters fit into this triangle? So one way we can do this, we can count it just by going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can do that. But the way I want to talk about doing it is to count all the columns. If we count all the quarters, we add 1 plus 2 plus 3, we get 21 quarters are shown right here. And we can say that our quarters roughly fill this shape, okay? and that there's about 21 quarters in this triangle. But if we fill this triangle, the first thing I wanted to show you guys is that there's a little space in here, right?
Yes.
Where the quarters don't quite touch. And if we fill the triangle in, we see that there's like overhang on the quarters. So how can we make this a more accurate measurement? Well, let's use nickels now. Now we have a lot more columns, right? And what we can do is we can add up these columns again and say, okay, well, there's 36 nickels here. And now if I asked you, how big is this triangle, what would you say?
About 36 nickels.
And again, we did this by counting up all the columns. And now if we look at the inside of the triangle, the space in between the quarters are a little bit less. There's not as big of a gap between the quarters, or between the coins, making it slightly more accurate. And if we draw it, we say that there's a little less overhang, right?
Yes.
So let's go even smaller. Let's use a dime. And if we count up all of the columns the same way that we did before, then there's a lot more columns, so it's a little bit harder. We get 136 dimes. If we put this triangle over, we notice two things. One, the space is really small now compared to the quarters. It's still definitely there, but it's definitely smaller space. And if we fill this triangle up, it almost looks perfect.
Yes.
We know that there's a little bit of space inside that we have to deal with, but as far as the overhang is concerned, it's pretty much gone. Okay? It's still there, right? But there's a lot less. So now let's compare the three triangles we just talked about. The dimes is definitely the most accurate out of these three. We all agree?
Yes.
So we look at the columns that we used. The width of these columns is only as small as the width of this quarter or the coin. And so if we say this nickel has half the width of this quarter, and that this dime has a quarter, 1/4 of the width of this coin, we're taking our column and we're making it smaller and smaller and smaller. If we keep going on forever and ever and ever and making our coin smaller and smaller and smaller, making the width of this column smaller and smaller by using smaller coins, the accuracy is going to keep getting better and better. And if we make it infinity, our accuracy should be 100% eventually. So what would that look like? Well, let's take a look. This is a decent picture of what that might look like. Now, obviously, 1 over infinity is so small that we can't really represent it, right? We can't make an infinitely small column on a computer or even draw it, because we can always make it smaller, right? We can always add on to that infinity. But it might look something like this. And if we zoom in to this corner over here, we have these columns that go up, right? And imagine that these are the width of our infinitely small coins. If we add up all these columns, we would get the area of our triangle, and it would be 100% accurate. This is one of the big concepts that I want to drive home, is that 1 over infinity can be used to calculate area, to find the area. And this is huge, because this is one of the principles of calculus. This is the second most, arguably first most important idea of calculus, is that if we use infinitely small columns, we can find the area of anything. Okay? I want to talk about another concept that's really important to calculus, and that has to do with slope. Let's start by defining what slope is. So when I think about slope, what I think of is the incline of a ramp that you're riding from left to right. So for example, if we have this guy over here, he's on a skateboard, he's going up this incline, he's going left to right, we say that this is a positive slope because he's going up. Now this guy, same skateboarder, maybe he got to the top of the hill and he goes, oh, I gotta go down now. Now he's going down this from left to right. So our slope is negative, it's downhill. We understand the difference between those two?
Yeah.
Okay, so with this, let's move on to talking about apples. Let's say I have 10 apples and I eat 5 of them in 1 minute because I'm like a speed apple eater. And now I have 2 data points. I have 2 numbers, 2 groups of numbers. We can put this on a graph. This line tells us that if we go to any point on this graph, we can read how many apples we have at this minute. So we have this line, and what does this look like? Looks like a slope, right? And we can put our skateboarder on it. So this guy is going downhill So is it positive or negative?
Negative.
Negative. But what is the value of this slope? How can we calculate it? And more importantly, what makes this slope right here, so this line, different from this slope or this slope? What exactly is the numerical difference? What's the difference in the actual slope between these two, between these three? What we can do is say that the slope is equal to the number of apples that I ate over the time that I ate them. If we have this line, we start at 10, go to 5. How many apples did we eat?
5.
5. And how long did it take?
1 minute.
1 minute. So our slope is going to be negative 5. But what if we had a line that looks a little more complicated? This isn't a straight line. We have a line that looks something like this. It's not straight. It's not easy to calculate that slope. And the reason is because the slope changes. Let's look at a skateboarder here. He's probably going to go really fast. Like, that's a pretty drastic drop, right? It's a really negative slope. Do you agree?
Yeah.
And let's say that point, that slope is right here, okay? Pretty negative. And if we put the same skateboarder over here, he's like riding a flat ground. He's not really going anywhere, right? He's coasting. So that slope is maybe somewhere over here. But what's important is that this same graph, this same line, has many different slopes. Because this is different than this, which is different than this, and every single point is slightly different slope. So we want to be able to say, well, what is the slope at any given time, right? How fast is our skateboarder going if we follow this line at any given number? So if we look at this graph, and we sort of have it, okay? We take it and we cut it in half. So if you look on the bottom here, it goes from 1 to 10, and it looks like a pretty curvy line. Now, let's say that that's 1 over 1, and let's take a half of that. So now we go from 0 to 5. Look at the numbers on the bottom. We go from 0 to 5 in our time, okay? So if we go again, now we go from 1 to 2.5. Now it looks like an even more straight line. And if we go again, 1 to 1.25, that almost looks like an exactly straight line. It's slightly different. It's slightly not straight. It has a slight curve to it, but it's definitely a lot better. And remember, all we did is we went from 10 to 5 to 2.5 to 1.25. We kept having that number, okay? And it looked more and more straight. So the question is, what are we doing here? What I would say is that we started at 1 over 1. Let's say we start at 1 over 1, and we have it. We get the 1 over 2. So now we're at half of our initial graph, centered about 1, because 1's always there, right? And we half that. Now we're at 1 over 4. You following me? We keep having the length of our graph centered about 1. And we're getting this number on the right is getting closer and closer and closer to 1, right? So what would happen if we go a distance of 1 over infinity? It would be a straight line. Remember, infinity is not a number. Infinity is a concept. And 1 over infinity is infinitely small. So we go from 1 to 1 plus 1 over infinity. And what we see is we recover a straight line. Doesn't that blow your mind? Yeah. Remember, we started out at this.
Yeah.
And we said you can't measure that slope because it's different everywhere. It's different. Every single point on this graph has a different slope. But if we have it more and more and we focus in on 1, we focus in right here. We're focusing on this time. And we look at only that instant of time, it looks like a line. We said before that every single point has a slope. And we also said that in order to measure that slope, we need a straight line. So if we look at an instant in time that is essentially just 1 point, we better get a line, because we need a line to measure the slope there. Do you agree?
Yeah.
So this makes complete sense. If we look at a time from 1 to something just after 1, infinitely close to 1, it better look like a line, because we want to be able to measure that slope, because we know it exists. And that's important, is that we know this slope has to exist, so there must be a line there. And the question is, how we have to just be able to look only at that point in time to find that line. And this is very important, because we can measure the slope of this line. Based on this picture, We know that it exists, and we know that it's calculable. We know that we can find it if we have the right tools. I want you to leave with this idea that 1 over infinity can be used to find the slope of a curved line. And this is also crucial. This is, remember how I said the area was like this central, one of the two central ideas of calculus? This is the other one. This is the second half of the complete picture of calculus, is that we can use calculus to not just find the area of a shape, but to find the slope of a function, of a line, of a graph, that otherwise we wouldn't be able to find the slope of. All right, so let's just recap what we learned today. We learned, most importantly, that infinity is not a number. Infinity is a concept. And we also learned that 1 over infinity is not equal to 0. It leads to 0. It goes to 0. If we look at 1 over infinity, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller because it's infinitely small and goes to 0. And 1 over infinity allows us to find the area of shapes using really small, infinitely small columns, which is crazy. If I give you a weird object, like maybe I give you something that looks like this, how do you find the area of that thing? That's pretty hard, right? You won't have a formula for that. We want to be able to use the columns. We also showed that 1 over infinity allows us to turn a curvy line like this, into a straight line at a specific point, at a specific time, which is amazing because it allows us to find the slope at any given time of a line that we normally wouldn't be able to. Students just beginning to study calculus always find the concepts of limits, derivatives, and integrals hard to understand. But when these concepts are broken down and explained in new, unique ways, such as by using coins to visualize integrals, they become infinitely easier to understand. In fact, the rather unconventional methods for teaching calculus used in this video allowed the same students who usually hate things like word problems to follow these daunting concepts.
You were actually really good at explaining everything. You gave a lot of details, and I think that was really good. It made sense. I could understand it. It made it easy to understand what you were trying to say.
So next time you hit a roadblock and want to give up because you just can't grasp a concept right away, take a step back and try to tackle the concept in a new way, just like we did with using pizza to explain infinity and skateboarders to explain slope. Then, once you dive into the awesome fields of mathematics, you will, just like the fifth graders in this video,
This summer I want to learn about molecule structure.
have a thirst for knowledge, and one day, just like those students, go on to change the world.
Hello everyone, it's Aunt Fernita. Today's story is called The Golden Rule. The memory verse is from Matthew chapter 7, verse 12. It says, "So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you." Today's message is Jesus helps me treat others as I want to be treated. Sarah frowned. The other girls in the lunchroom were pointing at her and laughing. Why were they always so unkind? Then the thought came to her, what would Jesus do? And she looked right at those girls and smiled. Jesus taught that we should treat others as we want to be treated. Imagine that a young boy named Ephraim is listening to Jesus speak. Ephraim got up just before daylight. Would he be pulling weeds in the garden today? Then his father spoke. Today, we are going to listen to Jesus. Ephraim was happy. He had heard that Jesus was the Messiah, and he really wanted to hear what Jesus had to say. Jesus was healing people by the seashore, and the beach was filling up with people. Ephraim and his family hurried to find a place. They watched as some rulers arrived. The rulers frowned at the crowd. Jesus began to climb the hill away from the beach. The people pushed along behind him until they came to a quiet meadow. Jesus sat down near a tree. His disciples pressed through the crowd to be near him. All around him, people sat quietly as he began to speak. The rulers stood in the shade of a nearby tree. Jesus spoke calmly, but so all could hear. Make the kingdom of God first in your life. Ephraim thought, the kingdom of God? What does that mean? Don't judge other people, and you won't be judged yourself. Ephraim thought of the rulers who believed they were better than others. He wondered, could it be possible that God cares about humble people? Is there any place in Jesus' kingdom for me and my family? Then Jesus taught a lesson about finding fault and judging people. Jesus said, "Why do you look at the speck of a sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take out the speck,' when all the time there is a plank in your own? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Ephraim grinned as he imagined how it would look to have a big plank of wood in his eye. Everyone was laughing, except some of the rulers. Jesus spoke of God's love. Then he announced a rule of his kingdom. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. Now Ephraim understood. In Jesus' kingdom, everyone would treat everyone else fairly. They would not find fault with each other. Instead, they would want Jesus to remove their faults. People would live to serve others. Today's story is called First Things Last. The memory verse is from Mark chapter 10, verse 43. It says, "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant." The message is Jesus wants me to put others first. Think of a time when you wanted to be first. Were you in line or playing a game? What does the Bible say about trying to be number one? James and John were two of Jesus' disciples. They had been with Jesus from the beginning, and they wanted to be his favorite helpers. Imagine that they are talking with each other about this. "What a kingdom Jesus is going to have!" exclaimed James. "It will be richer than any kingdom that has ever been." "It will be great because Jesus is fair," said John. "I'm glad that we have been with Jesus since the very first. We will be an important part of the new kingdom." "That's right," said James. "You will sit at Jesus' right hand in the new kingdom, and I will sit on the left." "Do you really think so?" questioned John. "Peter thinks he will be number one, not to mention Judas and Simon the Zealot. If we want to be first, we need to talk to Jesus and make sure." John thought about Jesus and how humble he was. But will Jesus be happy listening to us talk about being first? James spoke. "We need to talk about first place before some others do. We want to be near him so we can do things his way. I know. Let's get Mother to ask him." It was not long before their mother arrived and they told her of their plan. She went to Jesus and smiled. "Will you do something for me?" Jesus looked at her kindly. "What would you like me to do for you?" "In your kingdom, let my sons be on your right side and your left side," she said. "They will do the things you want." Jesus' face became very sad. He turned to James and John. "Are you able to face the trouble and the pain that I must face?" Eagerly, James and John answered, "Oh, yes, Lord, we can face your troubles." Jesus replied, "Yes, you will face my problems and deal with my pain. But I must tell you that it is not my job to give out positions in God's kingdom. My Father has a plan for each of you. He is the one who will decide about positions in the kingdom." There was a sputter from behind Jesus. The other disciples were angry. Each one wanted to be the most important person in Jesus' kingdom. Why should young John be ahead of them? They all wanted to be first. Jesus moved to a quiet place and called all the disciples to him. "Think about the people who don't know God," he said. "Those people have kings who order people around every day. People are beaten down and forced to obey. But my kingdom is not like that. I came to serve others. My people must serve others. To be a leader in my kingdom, you must first learn how to serve. That's how my kingdom works." Jesus' kingdom is still like that. He asks everyone in his kingdom to be unselfish. He wants us to put others first. Today's story is called Friends Find a Way. The memory verse is from Romans chapter 12, verse 10. It says, "Be devoted to one another in brotherly love." The message is, I serve Jesus when I bring others to him. Do you know someone who has a very serious disease? If they needed to see a doctor, would you rip off the hospital roof to get them inside? One sick man's friends did something like that. If you had taken a walk in the town of Capernaum one certain day, you probably would have heard, "Jesus is in town! Jesus is in town!" A crowd of people hurried to a house where Jesus was healing and teaching. And what a crowd it was! There was no room inside the house. There was no room in the yard either. All kinds of people were in that house with Jesus. Pharisees, teachers of the law, ordinary people, and many, many sick people. There was a very sick man in that town, and oh, how he wanted to meet Jesus. But he had a problem. He was paralyzed. How could he get to Jesus? He couldn't move. All he could do was lie on his bed and think about how sick he was. If only he could meet Jesus. He just knew that Jesus would make him well. The paralyzed man was fortunate in at least one way. He had 4 very good friends who were happy to carry him to Jesus. Each took a corner of his mat, and off they went. But when they found the house where Jesus was healing, they couldn't reach Jesus. There were people everywhere. No one would let them through the crowd. So near and yet so far. The sick man was worried that he wouldn't see Jesus after all. What could he and his 4 friends do? There had to be a way to get through that crowd. His friends took him up to the roof of the house. How strange! Have you ever entered a house from the roof? It isn't easy. Do you know what the 4 friends did next? They made a hole in the roof, big enough for their sick friend and his mat to fit through. Then, with ropes, they let the sick man on his bed down, down, down. He landed right in front of Jesus. Jesus' eyes were so kind. He said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." "Forgiven? I'm forgiven," the man said to himself. "What a happy day!" The Pharisees and teachers of the law were not happy about this. They had already refused to help this man because of his sins. They thought to themselves, "How dare Jesus try to forgive sins? Only God can forgive sins." Jesus could read their minds. He spoke strongly to them. "Why are you thinking these things? People need to be helped. Which is easier, to say you are forgiven or to say you are healed? You will soon know that I can forgive sins on earth." Then Jesus turned to the paralyzed man and said, "Rise up, take your bed and go back to your house." Suddenly, the man could move his legs and his arms. He was healed all over. He got up, rolled up his mat, and carried it out the room and headed home. This time the crowd let him through. Everyone was amazed and praised God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." The 4 friends were really happy that they had brought their friend to Jesus. How about you? Do you want to bring someone to Jesus? Today's story is called Seeing is Believing. The memory verse is from John chapter 9, verse 25. It says, "One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." The message is, I will tell others what Jesus has done for me. Have you ever awakened in a room that was so dark you couldn't see a thing, not even your own hands? How would you manage if everything around you was that dark all the time? That's what it's like to be blind. A blind man sat beside the road and begged. He had been born blind. There was nothing else he could do to support himself. Sometimes he wondered why he was born blind. He thought it was his parents' fault. People back then believed that sickness, blindness, and other problems came to people who sinned. He heard a crowd of people coming closer. "Please give! Please give!" the blind beggar cried. "Help the poor blind among you." He heard a man ask, "Who sinned, this man or his parents? Why was he born blind?" The blind man strained his ears. He wanted to hear the answer. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened to bring praise to God. Then the blind man felt some mud being put on his eyes. In a kind voice, Jesus said, "Go and wash your eyes in the pool of Siloam." The blind man obeyed. Someone led him to the pool. He washed off the mud. The sun was shining. He could see people. Colors painted the whole world. When people asked him how he was able to see, he told them what Jesus had done. Jesus had healed the blind man on the Sabbath. Some people were not happy about that. The leaders said that Jesus broke the Sabbath. Others said Jesus was bad, so he could not have made a blind person see. They tried to show that the blind man's healing wasn't real. But the man who was born blind said to them, "One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I can see." If Jesus is not from God, he could not open the eyes of a man born blind. The leaders became very angry with the healed man. They believed that he was born blind because he was a sinner. And they did not want this healed man telling people what Jesus had done for him. So they put the man born blind out of their church. Jesus heard about this, and he looked for the man. When he found him, he said, "Would you like to believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. Jesus said, "You have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you." The man said, "Lord, I believe." Then he fell on his knees and worshiped Jesus. Jesus told him, "I came to this world to make the blind see and to show some who think they see how blind they are." The man born blind shared with others what Jesus had done for him. He even told those who didn't love Jesus. Have you shared with someone what Jesus has done for you? Today's story is called Lost and Found. The memory verse is from Matthew chapter 18, verse 14. It says, "Your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost." The message is Jesus comes looking for me when I am far from him. 7-year-old Carla was with her mother at the market. She wandered away to watch a man showing how a toy plane worked. When she looked around, her mother was nowhere in sight. Carla was afraid. She was lost and she didn't know what to do. A long time ago, a little lamb was lost. Let's read about it. Broken bits of bushes stuck to the wool of the tired sheep as they moved along the path. The shepherd gently guided his flock of 100 sheep. The scraping sounds of their hooves on the rocks mixed with the bleating of the young ones. It was music to the shepherd's ears. "Come back over this way," he coaxed, smiling at a playful lamb. The sheepfold was in sight now. Like most of the sheepfolds in the area, the shepherd had made it secure. He had piled many rocks on top of each other. Then he placed thorn bushes along the outside of the rocks. Finally, the shepherd and the sheep reached the sheepfold gate. As each one went into the sheepfold, he checked it carefully for cuts or bruises. He ran his strong but gentle hands over every sheep. The shepherd spoke soothing words and poured medicine on sore places. The impatient animals bumped against one another, eager to get in to rest. Tired and hungry, the shepherd would be glad to reach home as well. 94, 95, 96, the shepherd counted. Every morning he took his sheep to pasture, and every evening he counted them as he brought them home. 97, 98, 99, he kept counting. 99? What? Thought the shepherd. I'm so tired tonight that I didn't count correctly. Slowly he counted again. A frown crossed his face. 97? 98? 99? His eyes checked every ewe, every ram and lamb. Oh no! Where was the little lamb the shepherd had been calling back to the flock? It was just a short time ago. Now it was nowhere in sight. That one sheep could be anywhere. Carefully, the shepherd latched the gate to the sheepfold. He turned back the way he had just come, despite the rising storm. He called out to his missing sheep. I really have to listen, he thought. With the wind blowing like this, it will be hard to hear, especially if my lamb is hurt. The shepherd called. Then he listened. Then he called again. Carefully, the shepherd worked his way in the dark back over the rough ground. Where are you, little one? He thought. The stinging rain began to make the rocks slippery. The wild wind howled. How could the small lamb have strayed so far in such a short time? Straining once more to hear anything, he paused. Yes, he shouted into the storm. Yes, I found you. There it was, just over there, beside some rocks. The lamb lay in a crumpled heap, tangled in thorns and bleeding. Okay, you'll be fine. The shepherd's gentle words calmed the frightened lamb. He untangled the thorns and scooped the lamb up into his arms. "I'm so glad I found you," he whispered. "Let's go home." The rugged shepherd hiked back over the slick trail again, but this time he smiled. This time he was holding his rescued one close. Bursting into the house, the shepherd gently laid the sheep down. He cried joyfully, "I have found my lost sheep." He was so happy, he wanted to share the good news with all his friends. When we wander far from Jesus, he comes looking for us too. We are his sheep. He loves us so much, and he is very happy when all his sheep are safe at home again. Today's story is called Too Precious to Lose. The memory verse is from Luke chapter 19, verse 10. It says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." The message is Jesus looks for me because I am precious to him. Kristen's best friend Kaylin gave her a special book for her birthday. One day, Kristen lost the book. She looked all over for it. In our story today, Jesus tells about a woman who lost something important. Perhaps it happened like this. The morning sun warmed the back of the busy women. Laughter rippled through the crowd as they shared stories. Laundry day meant hard work, but happy visiting. As the women scrubbed and rinsed, they had something new to talk about. "Have you heard the stories Jesus tells?" asked one. "They are so interesting," said another. "He understands how we live." Back and forth they talked about seeing the sick people healed and about the kind things Jesus said. "I hope to take the children to listen to him tomorrow," smiled a young mother. "Oh, I would love to go along," agreed another. Soon, several of the women were making plans for the next day. Happy children skipped along beside their mothers the next day. Excitement was in the air. Soon all the people sat down and Jesus began to speak. He told them a story about a shepherd losing one of his sheep and how happy the shepherd felt when he found it. Then Jesus began to tell a story that the little group of laundry ladies leaned forward in to hear. There once was a woman who had 10 silver coins. One day, the woman lost one of her silver coins. Oh no! The women thought about the poor woman in the story. That was about the most awful thing that could happen to a wife. What would her husband say? What would her neighbors and friends say? The lady lit a lamp and began to sweep her house, Jesus went on. She looked everywhere for her lost coin. Jesus watched the faces of the people listening to his story. He knew what their homes were like. Because they had small windows or no windows at all, it was dark inside, even in the daytime. It would be hard to find a coin. She kept searching. She would just not give up. On the table, under the table, behind the heavy water pot, she looked and looked. She searched the dirt floor. Suddenly she saw it. "I found it," she cried, quickly picking up the smooth coin. Dashing outside, she ran to her neighbors and friends. "Come, celebrate with me. I lost one of my coins, and now I've found it." Many in the crowd laughed with relief. Jesus laughed with them. With a twinkle in his eye, he added, "There is rejoicing in the presence of angels of God over one sinner who repents." Today's story is called Safe in the Storm. The memory verse is from John chapter 14, verse 27. It says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. Do not be afraid." The message is God's grace calms my fears. Jamie and her parents were out on a lake in their canoe. Suddenly, dark, ugly clouds rolled in. It started to rain, and the wind began to blow hard. The canoe rocked up and down on the rough waves. Thunder growled and lightning flashed. Jamie was really afraid. Her parents paddled as fast as they could to get to shore. Jesus and his disciples were also caught in a storm on a lake. Let's read their story. Jesus had been teaching and healing people all day long. It was evening now, and there were still many people who wanted to be near him. He had been working long hours every day, and he was exhausted. Across the lake, it was so peaceful. The towns along the shore were quiet and small. Jesus thought it would be a nice place to go and relax. He turned to the crowd of people. "We have had a good day, but it is time to rest," he said. Turning to his disciples, Jesus asked, "Are you ready, friends?" They nodded and climbed into the boat. Jesus joined them. As they pushed off, they noticed other fishing boats on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus was so glad to be able to rest for a while. He lay down in the back of the boat. The restful sound of the waves may have helped Jesus go to sleep. Some of the disciples had been fishermen on this very lake. They loved to hear the night sounds and to feel the cool wind. But suddenly the wind changed direction, as it sometimes does on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples looked at the sky. "Might be a storm," someone said. "That could be," another agreed. They braced themselves as the wind howled down from the mountains. Storms often came up suddenly on the Sea of Galilee, and that is just what happened. Lightning flashed and thunder crashed. Huge waves soon began to splash into the boat. The disciples had to shout to hear one another. The disciples knew all about sailing and fishing. They knew all about boats and storms, but they didn't know what to do now. They were more than afraid. They were terrified. Then someone thought of Jesus. "Jesus! Jesus!" he shouted. The disciples had been trying so hard to do everything that good fishermen do in a storm that they had forgotten about Jesus. A flash of lightning cracked through the sky, and they all saw Jesus, still sleeping. Sleeping? "Wake up, Jesus! Save us! We're about to drown!" they yelled. Jesus stood up in the rocking boat. He saw the frightened faces of the disciples. They were wet and tired and helpless. Jesus lifted his hands. "Quiet," he said. "Be still." And right away, the storm just stopped. No more wind, no more lightning, no more waves crashing in. "Why were you afraid?" he asked the disciples. "Where is your faith?" The storm had pushed many of the boats close together, and now every person in every boat just stared at Jesus. He was not afraid, not even a little bit. Everybody began to whisper about Jesus. What kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Today and forever, Jesus is always with us. He knows what we need, and he will care for us wherever we go, whatever we do, if we will call on him as the disciples did. Today's story is called Appointment with God. The memory verse is Matthew chapter 12, verse 8. It says, "For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." The message is the Sabbath is a day to learn more about God's love. Lisa came home from school on Friday. There was that wonderful smell again. Mom was baking bread for Sabbath. Lisa washed her hands and helped her mother finish the Sabbath dinner. Lisa loved Sabbath. This week after church, they were going to have lunch near a duck pond and then take a walk in the woods. Lisa couldn't wait. In today's story, Jesus and his disciples were taking a Sabbath walk too. Let's join them. Jesus loved the Sabbath. He loved to spend time with his friends and talk with them about the love of God. He loved to help people who were sick or sad feel better. One Sabbath, Jesus and his disciples passed through a field of grain. Jesus and the disciples were hungry. In those days, the people had permission to eat food from another person's farm. If people were hungry and had no food with them, they could eat a few grapes in a vineyard, or they could pick some wheat stalks and eat the little kernels of grain. So as Jesus' disciples walked through the field, they picked some stalks. They rubbed the heads of grain back and forth in their hands. When just the little kernels were left, they tossed the kernels into their mouths. The crunchy grain tasted good, but not everyone was happy. Pharisees nearby decided that the disciples were doing something wrong. They said to Jesus, "When your disciples picked up the wheat and rubbed it in their hands to get the kernels out, that was like a farmer working. So they are breaking the Sabbath." The Pharisees had taken God's beautiful Sabbath commandment and had made it into their own rule. They made up lots of extra rules that made Sabbath a heavy burden. God wanted Sabbath to be a special day for people to enjoy. He wanted them to learn about his love, but because of these extra rules, many people did not enjoy Sabbath. Jesus loved these Pharisees. He wanted them to know the joy of Sabbath too. Jesus asked them some questions to make them think. "Do you remember David?" he asked. One time, he and his men were very hungry, so they ate the special temple bread that was really just for the priests. The Pharisees knew about that. If that was okay, then eating grain on Sabbath is okay too, Jesus continued. People should not suffer on Sabbath. The Sabbath is for people. I know, for I am Lord of the Sabbath. On another Sabbath, while Jesus was in the synagogue, he saw a man whose hand was crippled. Jesus asked the people, "What do you think? Is it right to do good on the Sabbath?" Some of the people didn't think the man should be made well because it was Sabbath. Jesus asked them another question to make them think. If one of your sheep fell into a hole, wouldn't you pull it out? A person is so much more valuable than an animal. Therefore, it is right to do good on the Sabbath. Then Jesus said to the crippled man, "Stretch out your hand." The man's hand was completely healed. Jesus wants us to know that Sabbath is a day for joy and healing. Sometimes children think that Sabbath is a do not day. Do not do this, do not do that. Actually, Sabbath is a do day. On Sabbath, we have more time to do something special, to do fun things that teach us about God's love. God created the Sabbath so together we can spend time with Him and learn more and more about His wonderful love. Today's story is called A Bitter Choice. The memory verse is from Luke chapter 22, verse 42. It says, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." The message is I thank Jesus for choosing to save me. Have you ever been punished for something you did not do? If you were, how did you feel? In our Bible story today, we will learn about a choice Jesus made, a choice to be punished for something he didn't do. The Last Supper was over. Jesus and his disciples walked to the Mount of Olives. They climbed to the Garden of Gethsemane, a place where Jesus often prayed. Jesus led the disciples a little way into the garden. "Wait here," he said. Then Jesus asked Peter, James, and John to go further into the garden with him. "Watch and pray," Jesus told them. Jesus moved on a little further. Quietly, he prayed, "Father, if it is your will, take this cup from me." He longed for someone to share his sorrow. He returned to the 3 men, but they slept. 3 times he prayed that same prayer. 3 times he sought comfort from the 3 disciples. A bright light shone from Jesus' direction. A shining angel cradled Jesus in his arms, talking quietly. Jesus became calm and serene. He had been strengthened to meet the cross. "Get up," said Jesus to Peter, James, and John. "It is time to go. My enemies are coming." They hardly reached the other disciples when lights of a mob approached. Many soldiers, people, and some leaders of Israel were led into the garden by Judas. Judas greeted Jesus with a kiss. "Whom do you seek?" Jesus asked the mob. "Jesus of Nazareth," they answered. "I am he," Jesus replied. Jesus could have escaped, but he chose to stand before the mob. The disciples watched, silent with wonder. The mob quickly gathered around Jesus. He spoke again. "If you seek me, let these others go their way," he said, pointing to the disciples. Then the soldiers used ropes to tie Jesus' hands together. The disciples couldn't believe their eyes. They thought Jesus would just walk away. He had done that before. But this was different. The mob began to move back down into the valley. They were taking Jesus towards the high priest's palace. This was unbelievable. The disciples turned and ran away. They couldn't understand why Jesus would let himself suffer like this. It was amazing love that led Jesus to choose to suffer. Love for all those he and his Father had created. Love for you and me. Today's story is called Judging Jesus. The memory verse is from Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5. "But he was pierced for our transgressions, and by his wounds we are healed." The message is, I praise Jesus for saving me. When Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, all the disciples ran away.